What if the gods didn't vanish from Earth, but simply learned to govern without being seen? Mesopotamian texts preserve a strange pattern. Gods who once ruled directly alongside humans suddenly stop appearing in the same way while the systems they established continue to operate as if nothing changed. This isn't speculative fiction. Whatever we ultimately decide these texts mean, the pattern is documented across thousands of cuneiform tablets spanning nearly 3,000 years of continuous civilization, temple archives, royal inscriptions, legal codes, and ritual procedures. Again and again, these records reference divine beings called the Anunnaki, described as administrators, judges, and decree makers who assigned cities distributed cosmic authority and once governed the world directly. And then after the Great Flood, they withdraw. Here's what makes the shift unsettling. The architecture of power doesn't collapse when the gods stop appearing physically. Kings still rule by divine mandate. Priests still guard divine knowledge. Laws still arrive from heaven. Temples still function as contact points with the sky. The entire machinery remains intact. Only the gods themselves, at least as physically present rulers, are no longer visible in the same way. None of this is hidden in restricted archives. These texts have been translated and discussed in academic contexts for over a century. Many sit in museums around the world, written on clay tablets small enough to hold in your hand. And crucially, these aren't only myths preserved in isolation. The record includes administrative lists, king lists, legal prologues, and ritual instructions, documents describing governance and procedure, while claiming an origin beyond humanity itself. One text captures the transition with a kind of blunt precision, the Sumerian king list. It survives in multiple copies from several sites. The most complete version was discovered in 1922 by a British expedition at the ruins of Larsa in what is now southern Iraq. What makes it remarkable isn't only its age, it's its structure. The king list reads like a document split into two halves by a single catastrophic event. Before the flood, it describes kingship as something that descended from heaven, not as a metaphor, but as a literal transfer of authority from the divine realm to earth. It names specific cities. It names specific rulers. It gives sequences of power. And then the flood arrives, and the list resumes, same style, same documentary, voice naming kings, cities, dynasties. But now after the flood, the list includes rulers we can cross-check historically. Archaeology confirms the existence of some of these individuals. Their names appear on excavated inscriptions. Their cities can be identified. Gilgamesh appears in the list. So does Enmebaragesi of Kish, whose name has been found on actual artifacts. That creates a tension modern interpretation has to deal with. If the post-flood section is treated as genuine historical record and mainstream scholarship does treat at least portions of it that way, then what do we do with the pre-flood section, written by the same scribes in the same style as part of the same continuous narrative? The document itself draws no boundary. It presents divine rule and human rule as one chain of authority interrupted only by the flood, and the king list is only the entry point. Across thousands of Mesopotamian texts, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, a consistent pattern emerges. Early narratives describe gods as active decision-makers. They assign domains, judge disputes, issue decrees, manage the world through visible presence. Later texts still reference those same gods, still invoke their authority, still claim their mandates. But the mechanism changes. Divine authority now flows through intermediaries. Priests interpret divine will through ritual. Kings rule as appointed representatives. Justice is administered in a god's name. The gods are no longer here, but the system behaves as though they are still in charge. This isn't simply a story about myths fading from human imagination. Civilizations do lose stories. But what we're looking at here is stranger, a governance system that continues functioning as if the gods remain operative after they stop appearing. A civilization that behaves as though power originates beyond humanity and does not seem to publicly question whether that power truly left, which leads into the question that shapes everything that follows. If the Anunnaki were once described as rulers who walked on Earth, issued commands, and governed directly, and if the systems they established, divine kingship, priestly mediation, heavenly law, sacred bloodlines remained fully operational after they withdrew, then what kind of disappearance leaves behind a world that still obeys? If you're drawn to mysteries hidden in ancient records, you can subscribe and stay with this investigation as it unfolds. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there, because these stories traveled across millennia, and it's quietly fascinating to watch the discussion travel across time zones. The visuals in this video are here for atmosphere, but they aren't necessary. If you want, close your eyes, let the evidence speak in its own voice. To understand what the Anunnaki's withdrawal might actually mean, we first have to understand what their presence looked like in the earliest sources, not as poetic symbols, not as distant cosmic forces, but as something more structured. Administrators with assigned roles, councils, and direct authority over earthly affairs. So let's start where the written record starts. One of the first things you notice when you read these early materials is what isn't there. The oldest texts don't describe a departure. There's no farewell speech, no final decree, no dramatic ascension memorialized the way cultures often dramatize major transitions. Instead, the Mesopotamian record suggests something quieter, and in its own way, more unsettling. The gods simply stop appearing in the same mode. Early narratives depict divine beings making decisions and managing the world directly. Later texts still invoke them, still claim their mandates, but now their will arrives through channels, kings who speak for them, priests who interpret them, rituals that maintain contact, omens that signal intentions. The system remains, the source becomes invisible, and the scale of the record matters here. Mesopotamia offers the longest continuous written archive of any ancient civilization, over 3,000 years of cuneiform inscriptions preserved on clay. This isn't an oral tradition floating through centuries of retelling. It's written memory receipts, letters, legal contracts, temple inventories, royal proclamations, ritual manuals, prayers. A society documenting itself. Within that documentation, the Anunnaki appear not as a modern invention, but as a consistent category in Mesopotamian religious language. The term surfaces across Sumerian hymns, Akkadian epics, Babylonian prayers, Assyrian inscriptions. Sometimes they're described as a council, sometimes as judges of fate, sometimes as gods who descended to establish order. They are named and assigned roles. They are invoked in legal contexts. They appear in coronation language. Then, over time, the record shifts in how it frames their activity. The earliest narratives like Atrahasis and the Eridu Genesis describe the Anunnaki making decisions in assemblies, creating humanity, assigning labor, managing resources, intervening directly when problems arise. The gods aren't decorative. They act, they debate, they issue decrees called cosmic principles that govern everything from kingship to metallurgy to temple construction. Divine presence is operational. But by the time we reach clearly historical dynasties, rulers whose names appear on foundation stones and seals, something has changed. Kings still claim their thrones were granted by gods. Priests still perform rituals. Law codes still invoke heavenly authority. Yet the gods no longer appear as characters inside the narrative of day-to-day governance. They become authors of authority rather than actors within it. Meanwhile, the infrastructure attributed to them remains intact. Cities still have patron deities. Their temples still function as economic and political centers. Kingship is still described as descending from heaven. Justice is framed as the execution of divine will. Priests maintain elaborate systems of divination, reading livers, observing stars, interpreting oil patterns to discern what the now absent gods want. The machinery of divine rule keeps operating without the physical presence of its operators. That creates a historical puzzle that conventional interpretation often tries to soften. If the Anunnaki were merely symbolic representations of natural forces, philosophical concepts, why do the texts treat them as historical administrators before the flood, and as ongoing sources of authority after it? Why doesn't the narrative style change to signal metaphor? The scribes who preserved the king list, who copied Atrahasis, who carved Hammurabi's legal prologue, who recorded temple rituals for centuries, they don't mark the transition as a change in genre or reality. To them, it reads like one continuous system. The transition isn't described as a crisis. There's no divine war driving the gods away, no defeat, no successful rebellion. The flood disrupts the world, certainly, but after the waters recede, kingship descends from heaven again. Authority resumes as if it never left, only routed through different channels. This makes Mesopotamia feel different from some other mythological traditions when you compare how divine presence fades. In some cultures, gods become literary figures or philosophical symbols over time. Here, divine authority doesn't become poetic. It becomes procedural. Every coronation invokes the gods' approval. Every law code claims their authorship. Every ritual maintains the connection. Every omen reading searches for guidance. The civilization continues to orient itself toward beings no longer visibly present, but whose absence seems to strengthen, not weaken, the institutions acting in their name. So, now we can sharpen the question into something more specific. If the Anunnaki were once described as decision-makers in the world, what did that rule actually look like in the oldest sources? And what exactly changes later? To answer that, it helps to set aside the modern habit of treating gods as distant cosmic forces. In texts like Atrahasis and Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki don't govern through vague mystery. They convene in assemblies. They argue. They decide policy. They divide the labor of running the world the way a state divides administrative departments. Enki receives dominion over the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm tied to irrigation and fertility. Enlil governs the atmosphere, winds and storms that determine agriculture. Inanna claims authority over warfare, love, and the planet Venus. Utu administers justice and oaths. Ninhursag oversees birth and the health of living things. These aren't only poetic aspects, they function like jurisdictions. And the Sumerian concept of me reinforces that administrative feel. The me, often translated as divine decrees or cosmic ordinances, aren't abstract principles floating in philosophy. They are the components of civilization, kingship, priesthood, law, weaponry, music, writing, sexual intercourse, truth-telling, craftsmanship. In Sumerian tradition, these aren't presented as inventions developed gradually by humans. They arrive as a designed package, bestowed and distributed. In the myth, Inanna and Enki Inanna acquires the me from Enki and brings them to her city Uruk. It's described like a transfer of operating instructions for civilization from one divine administrator to another. So, in this framework, the gods are cosmic bureaucrats managing the blueprint of existence. And then comes a critical point. This structure doesn't remain confined to myth. It becomes the organizing principle of Mesopotamian city-states. Each major city claimed a patron deity who owned the city in a legal sense. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Eridu belonged to Enki. Nippur belonged to Enlil. Ur belonged to the moon god Nana. These weren't described as symbolic relationships. In the temple archives, the god is treated as the landlord and the human population as tenants working divine property. The temple in practice wasn't just a religious building. It was the administrative headquarters of the patron deity's estate. That matters because the economic record supports it. Temple complexes employed large numbers of workers, bakers, brewers, shepherds, weavers, scribes. They managed agricultural land. They collected taxes rendered as offerings. They distributed rations. They kept meticulous records. Archaeology has recovered thousands of administrative tablets from temple archives documenting inventories, labor assignments, textile production, livestock counts, grain shipments. It's an economic machine built around a central premise. The god resides in the temple's inner sanctuary and requires material support. Picture at dawn in a 3rd millennium Sumerian city. Farmers bring portions of their harvest to the temple. Scribes sit in courtyards and record deliveries on clay, updating inventories in the god's stores. Priests prepare the morning meal bread, beer roasted meat, arranging it before the cult statue in the sanctuary. Musicians perform. Incense burns. Ritual declares the god present, consuming offerings governing from a physical location. Meanwhile, the king, ruling as the god's appointed representative, issues judgments in disputes, framing decisions as enforcement of divine law rather than personal authority. Boundaries between fields are sacred because the gods assign land. Contracts are sworn before divine witnesses. Justice is about preserving cosmic order. In this system, religious and political aren't separate categories. The civilization is built as an extension of divine administration. But now the question becomes unavoidable. If gods once managed this system, directly residing in temples, receiving offerings, issuing decrees through oracles and omens, why does the same structure continue after the gods stop appearing physically? Why do temples remain economic centers even when the gods become absent landlords? Why do kings keep insisting their authority descends from heaven, even when heaven no longer sends visible confirmation? Why do priests still interpret divine will when that will arrives only through symbolic signs? The machinery outlasts the operators. And that changes what withdrawal might mean. A civilization can be structured around divine authority so thoroughly that the god's physical presence becomes optional. The decrees still carry force. The temples still hold authority. Kingship still descends. Humans execute every function while attributing it to divine origin. The administrative architecture becomes self-perpetuating. This is why the shift is different from simple mythological evolution. In some traditions, gods fade into stories. Here they fade into procedure, which leads into the next tension. If the gods governed through decrees and city temples, what happens when kings begin claiming those decrees as their own authority without the gods visibly appearing? Because alongside the temple economy, a second system emerges, one even more durable: kingship as a heavenly institution. The Sumerian king list begins with a line that makes the ideology explicit. After the kingship descended from heaven, it existed first in the divine realm and then transferred to earth as a complete system. already authorized, already legitimate, before any human claims it. That premise isn't isolated to the king list. It becomes the foundation of Mesopotamian political theory. Across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian periods, royal inscriptions repeat the same formula with almost ritual consistency. Kings don't present themselves as merely victorious warlords. In their official rhetoric, they are chosen by the gods, called by name, installed by divine decree. Their authority flows downward, from beyond human society. In inscriptions like those attributed to Ur-Nammu, the king describes the gods granting kingship, looking with favor, making his reign firm. In Hammurabi's prologue, the phrasing is structured so that the gods act first, they determine destinies, grant supreme rule, then name Hammurabi to establish justice. The pattern is consistent. The gods determine, the king executes. This is more than ceremonial ornament. In a world of competing city-states where dynasties rise and fall through conquest, the question who has the right to rule is existential. Strength can take a throne, but can't justify keeping it. Wealth can buy loyalty, but can't create obligation. Tradition can preserve a dynasty, but can't authorize the first king. Only heaven can do that. By anchoring kingship in divine origin, authority becomes something that transcends human politics. A king chosen by the gods isn't just stronger, he's cosmically legitimate. Opposing him isn't simply rebellion against a man, it is resistance to the order of the universe itself. And now we return to the king list because it pushes this ideology into a single continuous chain across the flood. Before the flood, kingship descends from heaven and passes through rulers across cities. Then comes the catastrophe. Then kingship descends again, immediately to Kish. The institution survives the apocalypse. More importantly, the list doesn't change its voice when it crosses from mythic time to historical time. Gilgamesh is listed in the same documentary format as Alulim. Both receive kingship from the same source. Both rule under the same mandate. The king list stitches sacred past and historical present into one seamless lineage of legitimacy. It functions like a rhetorical bridge current. Kings, by implication, rule with the same authorization as the legendary figures of antiquity. The age of gods walking on earth may have ended, but the mechanism they established kingship as a heavenly institution continues to function. And here, the system reveals a crucial feature. Authority doesn't require divine presence. It only requires divine origin. Once that principle is accepted, the question, do the gods still intervene, becomes almost secondary. The system runs on the premise that power flows from above, whether the source remains visible or not. In practice, kings ascending to the throne would participate in rituals designed to make divine appointment visible. They enter the temple of the patron deity. Priests invoke approval. Sacred objects are presented. Oaths are sworn. The procedure enacts the ideology, turning an invisible claim into a public reality. The ritual doesn't only reflect belief, it produces legitimacy. And because kingship is presented as divinely sourced, it becomes inheritable in ways purely human. Authority struggles to achieve. A son does not merely succeed his father through biology. He inherits a mandate framed as sacred continuity. Dynasty becomes theology. Succession becomes cosmic order. But if kings rule by heaven's authorization, then one more issue appears. Someone has to control access to heaven's voice. Someone must interpret divine will, confirm selection, certify legitimacy. Someone must publicly mediate between invisible authority and visible rule. And that brings us back to the temples. Temples in Mesopotamia weren't designed primarily as communal gathering places for worship, the way many modern religious buildings function. They were houses, literal residences, where a deity was believed to dwell in the inner sanctuary. The cult statue embodied the god. The statue required daily care. That care demanded a permanent professional class with exclusive access. Enter the priests. But to understand what the priests were doing, it helps to look past ritual imagery and focus on institutional reality. Temple archives from sites like Lagash and Nippur show institutions managing large workforces, agricultural land, industrial-scale textile production, beer brewing trade networks, and accounting systems that track distributions down to rations of grain and oil. One archive from Girsu contains tens of thousands of administrative tablets spanning just a few decades. They document daily temple operations with almost obsessive detail: livestock, slaughtered workers, fed fields, planted goods, traded resources allocated during festivals. These weren't only holy men contemplating the divine. They were bureaucrats managing a city's economic backbone. The genius of the system was that economic power and religious authority were fused because the god owned the land, controlled surplus, authorized distribution. Transactions became religious acts. Farmers didn't pay taxes to an abstract government. They rendered offerings to the deity. Workers didn't receive wages from an employer. They received rations from the god's household. Contracts weren't enforced merely by civic threat. They were sworn before divine witnesses believed to punish oath breakers. The temple was the interface where divine will became economic and political reality. And priests had another advantage, even more durable than surplus control literacy. In a society where writing required long training, scribes often bound to temple and administrative structures controlled the production of written knowledge. They composed royal inscriptions claiming divine appointment. They maintained archives documenting divine property. They copied myths describing how gods established civilization. They functioned as gatekeepers of memory. But more importantly, they controlled the technical knowledge required to communicate with absent gods. Because when divine presence becomes invisible, the civilization needs methods to discern divine will. Mesopotamia developed elaborate systems of divination ritual technologies meant to extract information from the divine realm through symbolic interpretation. Extispecie reading animal entrails became the most prestigious. Specialists would sacrifice a sheep, remove the liver, examine details of shape, texture, coloration, then compare observations against omen catalogs compiled over centuries. The liver wasn't treated as random flesh. It was treated as a message written by the gods in response to a question posed before the sacrifice. Oil divination followed a similar logic. Pour oil onto water in a sacred bowl. Interpret how it spreads, sinks, forms, shapes. Celestial observation tracked planetary movements, eclipses, atmospheric anomalies. Anything breaking normal patterns could be read as a sign. Astronomical diaries recorded events alongside earthly outcomes, building a database of correlations. The logic is remarkably consistent. If gods reside in heaven, and heaven is visible, then the sky contains encoded messages for those trained to read it. But notice what this requires: specialists, experts. A professional class with interpretive frameworks ordinary people cannot access. The gods might send signs, but only priests can decode them. Divine will become something produced through ritual technology, rather than directly experienced. Imagine the scene: a darkened temple at midnight. Priests gather around a sacrificed animal, Lamplight flickers over exposed organs. Silence, while the lead diviner examines the liver's surface, searching for irregularities that might indicate divine favor or displeasure regarding a king's decision. The god is no longer visibly present, yet the ritual makes the god's judgment feel manifest. The message is there in tissue, in texture, in subtle variation, if you know how to read it, and whoever controls interpretation controls access to the divine voice. This is how authority functions without presence. The gods do not need to appear for their will to be known. They only need to leave signs, and signs require readers. The priests don't replace the gods. They become necessary intermediaries without whom divine authority cannot be accessed. Withdrawal creates dependency. Now, something else happens in the historical record, and it deepens the structure. Kings begin publishing law codes as if the laws themselves are received from the gods rather than created by human rulers. Ur-Nammu's code presents legal judgments as part of a divine mandate to establish justice according to commands of Nana and Utu. Lipit Ishtar frames laws as fulfilling divine instructions. Hammurabi's stele depicts the king receiving symbols of authority from Shamash, then lists nearly 300 case laws. The laws are not presented merely as pragmatic solutions. They are framed as cosmic principles transmitted from heaven to earth through divinely chosen kingship. Obedience to law becomes obedience to the gods. Breaking law becomes disruption of divine order. And once again, the question of interpretation returns. Who determines whether justice has been served? Who maintains the records and procedures? Who ensures ritual standards align with the divine frame? The same institutional class, the priestly scribal apparatus managing temples, divination archives, and the language of legitimacy. The system closes into a loop. Kings rule by divine mandate. Laws come from heaven. Priests interpret divine will. Institutions control access to divine communication. And the entire structure references gods who are no longer present to confirm or deny any of it. Authority flows from an invisible source, through channels controlled by institutions, enforcing obedience to a will that can only be known through specialized interpretation. So now we can sharpen the next question. If priests become the interpreters of the gods, what happens when law itself is framed as divine transmission, locking society into obedience to an invisible source? That's where Hammurabi's stele becomes one of the clearest examples, not because it is unique, but because it is so explicit. The monument is tall, dark stone, and its upper section shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, receiving the symbols of justice and kingship. The image establishes the relationship before a single law is read. The king does not invent justice. He receives it. The prologue is structured around divine action. The gods act first. They determine destinies, grant power, establish kingship. Then they name Hammurabi to carry out a mission to cause justice to prevail, destroy the wicked, prevent oppression. Then come nearly 300 then laws. If a situation occurs, then a consequence follows. Property disputes, inheritance, false accusations, agricultural contracts, bodily injury. But the framing matters. These are not introduced as policy experiments. They are presented as the earthly manifestation of cosmic order. And the epilogue pushes the idea further. The stele itself becomes an oracle. The wronged man should come, have the stele read aloud, and let it clarify his case. In effect, revelation is embedded in stone. Human law functions like divine transmission. This pattern extends beyond Hammurabi. Earlier codes open with divine sanction. Later ones maintain similar formulas. Authority descends. Kings execute. Laws express cosmic order. The psychological power of this framework is difficult to miss. When law is recognized as human construction, it can, at least in principle, be questioned, revised, reformed. When law is framed as divine transmission, resistance becomes more than political dissent. It becomes sacrilege, a challenge not only to government, but to reality itself. Even if enforcement fails, the gods still see. Even if punishment is avoided, cosmic consequences remain. Omniscient oversight replaces the need for direct intervention. And because kings are framed as executors of divine justice, their political power becomes morally insulated. Obeying the king becomes religious obligation. The throne becomes sacred. Resistance becomes sin. At this point, the script widens the lens beyond Mesopotamia, not to introduce new data, but to highlight that the pattern isn't isolated. Across ancient civilizations, separated by geography and culture, the same formula appears. Law originates beyond humanity. Authority flows from above. Governance is enforcement of principles established by forces beyond human society. In Egypt, Ma'at represents cosmic order and justice established at creation. The pharaoh maintains it. In the Hebrew tradition, law is dictated by Yahweh and carved in stone. Obedience is obedience to God. In China, the mandate of heaven legitimizes rule as a heavenly grant. Dynasties shift, but authority still flows from above. Even in Greece, early lawgivers are tied to oracles and divine sources. The pattern repeats across cultures that developed independently. Either it reflects a universal psychological mechanism, how societies justify centralized authority as they grow complex, or it preserves memory of something that seemed to later people like authority from beyond. Mainstream scholarship tends to favor the first explanation. Divine kingship and priestly mediation are effective technologies of rule. They emerge naturally when societies require centralized authority. But even if we accept that, another question remains oddly persistent. Why does the narrative structure so often involve presence, followed by withdrawal? Why not gods who were always distant? Why remember a time when gods were closer? And now, returning to Mesopotamia with sharper focus, the mechanism of continuity becomes even more specific: bloodline. It's not enough for kings to claim divine appointment. They claim divine descent. The Sumerian king list includes rulers described as sons of gods. Gilgamesh's epic identifies him as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, his mother a goddess, his father mortal. In context, this isn't presented as metaphor. It functions like genealogy. Later dynasties continue the logic tracing legitimacy through family lines that supposedly connect back to divine origin. The right to rule passes through blood, making certain families inherently sacred. And once authority is embedded in lineage, it gains a kind of permanence that doesn't require repeated divine appearances. If kingship descends from heaven once and then inherits through blood, the system can run indefinitely without new, visible confirmation. That transforms the problem. Divine appointment explains why one individual claims the throne. Hereditary succession explains how the institution perpetuates itself without requiring the gods to show up for every transfer of power. Mesopotamian kings claimed not only divine favor, but divine ancestry, seed of a deity, descendants selected even in the womb. Royal hymns describe rulers as chosen before birth, formed specifically for kingship. If taken as ideology rather than literal biology, the function is still clear: It makes legitimacy bodily. It embeds authority into identity. It turns political hierarchy into cosmic hierarchy. And the implications are profound. If authority flows through bloodlines rather than achievement or consent, then challenging authority becomes nearly impossible without challenging the entire structure of reality the society claims to live within. You can overthrow a king. But how do you overthrow the premise that the king's family carries divine authorization? You can't negotiate with genealogy. This is why royal lineages become protected with obsessive care. Genealogies become sacred documents. Marriages become theological events. Succession becomes ritual. The throne becomes the afterimage of divine presence. The system persists even when gods become unseen because gods, whether literal beings, symbolic constructs, or memories, remain embedded as a blueprint. And that takes us to the next stage of the record, where the system doesn't merely preserve divine authority through lineage and law. It adds something more, the idea of ongoing surveillance through signs. If lineage preserved divine authority, what role did omens, astrology, and divination play in maintaining the sense that the gods were still monitoring the world? That's where we go next. By the late periods of Mesopotamian civilization, especially during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, something even more intricate appears in the record. The gods are no longer described as distant or silent. Instead, they are framed as constantly observing. This distinction matters. Absent gods might eventually be forgotten. Watching gods never are. Extensive omen literature from these centuries reveals a worldview structured around the assumption of continuous divine surveillance. The gods may no longer walk among humans, but they monitor everything through signs. Celestial movements, eclipses, planetary alignments, atmospheric irregularities. Each is treated as deliberate communication. The sky becomes a text, and reality itself becomes readable evidence of divine attention. This isn't casual superstition. It's systematic, documented, and treated as technical knowledge. Thousands of omen tablets have been recovered from sites like Nineveh and Babylon. They catalog correlations between celestial events and earthly outcomes in meticulous detail using conditional formulas that mirror legal reasoning. If an eclipse occurs in a particular month, then a king will die. If Jupiter rises in a certain constellation, then the harvest will prosper. If the moon is surrounded by a halo, then rebellion will break out. These tablets record centuries of observations, paired with historical events, building databases meant to reveal patterns in divine communication. The logic is internally consistent. If the gods reside in heaven and heaven is visible, then heaven's movements must encode meaning. Specialists known as Baru diviners trained for years to interpret these signs. They kept astronomical diaries recording lunar phases, planetary positions, and unusual phenomena. They consulted accumulated omen catalogs to advise kings on military campaigns, construction projects, public ceremonies, even travel schedules. This meant that no major decision was purely political. Everything was framed as response to divine signals. The psychological effect of such a system is difficult to overstate. Every eclipse becomes a potential warning. Every anomaly demands interpretation. The gods never appear physically, but their gaze feels constant, embedded in the predictable yet unreadable mechanics of the sky. You cannot escape observation when observation is written into the universe itself. And crucially, interpretation remains exclusive. The gods may speak through signs, but only trained specialists can read them. Divine will exist, but access to it is mediated. Authority depends not on revelation, but on interpretation. Neo-Assyrian royal correspondence preserves this vividly. Letters between kings and court astrologers show how deeply omen reading shaped governance. Kings delayed public appearances, postponed campaigns, altered daily routines based on astronomical advice. One astrologer writes to the king, "The king, my lord, should not go out on the 18th day. It is unfavorable. The moon will be eclipsed." Another reassures him that an eclipse signals danger, not to the king, but to his enemies. These aren't passive observations. They are political translations of divine communication. Interpretation becomes power. And astronomy is only one branch. Extispicy, liver divination, remains central. Clay models of livers covered in inscriptions have been found mapping specific features and their meanings. These functioned as technical manuals. Oil divination, smoke divination, dream interpretation, all followed structured systems. Reality itself becomes a field of signs. The gods communicate constantly, but only through channels that require expertise to decode. And that expertise is embedded within the same institutions that claim divine authority. This creates a civilization living under perpetual oversight without requiring divine presence. Every action might already be judged. Every plan must be checked against possible signs. You don't act first and seek approval, later you seek signals, then act accordingly. But notice what the system does not require. The gods never need to appear. They never need to speak directly. They never need to intervene visibly. The entire architecture operates on the assumption that they exist, that they watch, and that they communicate always, indirectly, always through mediated channels. And that mediation is everything. If someone questions the omens, they aren't merely questioning religious practice. They're challenging kingship law and cosmic order all at once. To doubt divination is to doubt the legitimacy of rule itself. Skepticism becomes existentially dangerous, which means the gods' withdrawal doesn't weaken authority, it strengthens it. Physical presence invites challenge. Absence combined with surveillance creates uncertainty, and uncertainty demands interpretation. Interpretation demands institutions. The late Mesopotamian world doesn't abandon the Anunnaki. It perfects governance through them while they remain unseen. Kings still claim divine appointment. Priests still mediate divine will. Laws still carry heavenly authority. And now every political decision can be justified as obedience to divine signals delivered through signs only specialists can interpret. The architecture is complete. Hereditary bloodlines preserve legitimacy. Priestly institutions control communication. Legal frameworks claim non-human origin. Surveillance through omens maintains psychological presence, all without requiring the gods to appear. At this point, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. If someone wanted to design a system of governance that could operate indefinitely without the physical presence of the authority that established it, this is exactly what it would look like. And that brings us back to the silence in the record. After examining thousands of years of Mesopotamian texts, from the earliest myths to the latest astronomical diaries, one fact stands out. There is no departure narrative. No epic describes the gods holding a final assembly. No ritual commemorates a farewell. No king records the moment the gods stopped appearing. No priest documents the day offerings ceased to receive response. The texts don't say the gods left. They simply stop describing them as active participants. What we can trace instead is a gradual shift across three modes. In mythic time, preserved in texts like Atrahasis Enuma Elish and the Eridu Genesis gods appear as characters. They debate, they assign roles, they intervene, they walk among humans. In historical time, documented in inscriptions, archives, and law codes, those same gods become sources of authority rather than actors. Kings rule because gods appointed them. Laws exist because gods authored them. Temples function because gods own them. But the gods themselves no longer appear in contemporary events. And in late astronomical time, particularly during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, the gods transform again, not absent, not present, but watching, communicating constantly through signs, observing without intervening. The transition between these modes isn't marked by crisis. It isn't announced. It isn't explained. It's seamless, almost invisible, only obvious in retrospect when texts from different centuries are placed side by side. The withdrawal is so quiet, it might not even be called a withdrawal. It's a reconfiguration. And the most striking thing is this: nothing about how civilization functions actually changes. After gods stop appearing as actors, kings still rule by divine mandate. Priests still interpret divine will. Laws still claim heavenly authority. Temples still manage resources on behalf of absent landlords. Divination still assumes constant observation. The machinery doesn't degrade. It becomes more elaborate. In fact, the systems claiming divine origin grow more institutionalized, precisely when divine presence becomes most invisible. Power operates without presence. Authority functions without appearance. Obedience continues without enforcement. All maintained through a governance architecture that behaves as though it were designed to operate indefinitely without its founders. So, how do we interpret this? History offers three broad explanations, each internally coherent, each grounded in different aspects of the evidence. The mainstream scholarly explanation treats divine rule as a technology of legitimacy. In this view, gods were never literal administrators. They were symbolic frameworks societies used to justify centralized authority during transitions from tribal to state organization. The shift from divine actors to divine authorizers reflects social maturation, not historical events. There is no withdrawal, only narrative evolution. The evidence supporting this view is strong, no archaeological proof of literal gods, and clear anthropological parallels showing similar legitimacy strategies across cultures. A second interpretation suggests that myths preserve distorted memories of real historical circumstances, not supernatural gods, but earlier human societies whose organization or knowledge seemed extraordinary to later cultures. The Anunnaki might represent memories of a predecessor civilization lost through catastrophe, whose systems were partially inherited but no longer fully understood. In this framework, the flood narratives preserve memory of real environmental upheaval. Long rains reflect alternative timekeeping. Heavenly descent encodes origins beyond the immediate cultural horizon. The third interpretation, the one implied by the structure itself, doesn't require gods to exist as beings at all. It observes that whatever the Anunnaki were literal, symbolic, remembered, or imagined. The system attributed to them behaves exactly like something designed to perpetuate itself without requiring their continued presence. Authority claims non-human origin, making it difficult to challenge. Legitimacy is embedded in bloodlines, making it biological rather than negotiable. Communication is controlled by institutions. Law is framed as cosmic principle. Surveillance maintains psychological presence without visibility. The system validates itself by referencing a source beyond itself. And what makes this interpretation unsettling is not what it claims about ancient gods, but what it implies about power. Because versions of this architecture persist long after the gods themselves fade from cultural memory. That's where we turn next. Part 3.3. When we widen the lens beyond Mesopotamia, the persistence of this architecture becomes impossible to ignore. Across civilizations separated by geography, language, and time authority follows the same structural logic. Gods once ruled directly, then they withdrew. But power continued to flow from above, mediated by institutions that claimed access to the withdrawn source. Ancient Egypt preserves the pattern clearly. Early religious texts describe a primordial age when gods ruled on earth. Ra governs as the first king before ascending to the sky. Osiris rules the living before becoming lord of the underworld. Divine presence gives way to divine distance. But authority does not weaken, it concentrates. Pharaohs become living gods, not metaphorically, but theologically. The pharaoh embodies Horus on earth, maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order. Temples serve as houses of gods. Priests manage resources, knowledge, ritual, and communication with the unseen divine realm. The gods withdraw into statues, into ritual, into specialized knowledge. But Egyptian civilization continues to operate, as if divine authority remains absolute. The Hebrew tradition reflects a similar shift. Early narratives depict God walking in the garden, speaking directly with humans, appearing physically to patriarchs. Over time, that immediacy fades. God retreats behind veils, speaks through prophets, reveals will through law rather than presence. The prophets themselves lament this distance. Truly, you are a God who hides himself. Yet divine authority never diminishes. Law still comes from heaven. Kings still rule under mandate. Obedience remains required. In Greece, early myths describe a golden age when gods and humans shared space. Later ages mark increasing distance. By historical periods, gods intervene indirectly through oracles, omens, dreams. The oracle at Delphi becomes a controlled access point to divine will mediated by priests. China's mandate of heaven follows the same logic. Authority flows from a cosmic moral source. Emperors rule as intermediaries. Heaven never appears yet. Legitimacy depends entirely on its favor, interpreted by scholars and officials trained to read signs and texts. Across cultures, the details differ, but the architecture remains. Presence, withdrawal, mediation, institutionalization. The pattern raises a question that resists easy dismissal. If societies independently develop these structures, why do they converge on the same narrative shape? Why do so many traditions remember a time when gods were closer? Mainstream scholarship answers because authority needs myth. Early societies externalize power to stabilize it. Over time, institutions replace belief in presence. That explanation may be sufficient, but it doesn't explain why the memory of presence persists. And returning to Mesopotamia, something sharper emerges. Authority doesn't merely claim divine origin, it claims divine inheritance. Kings aren't only chosen by gods, they are descended from them. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine. Sumerian rulers are sons of gods. Later kings are seed of deities. This isn't poetic flourish, it functions as genealogy. When legitimacy is inherited biologically, authority no longer requires repeated justification. It flows through blood. succession becomes sacred continuity. And this logic spreads globally. Egyptian pharaohs are gods incarnate. Japanese emperors descend from the sun goddess. Hebrew kingship binds itself to the Davidic line. European monarchies later claim divine right through sacred lineage. Blood becomes the vessel of legitimacy. If authority lives in lineage, you can't vote it out. You can't negotiate it away. You can only replace it by dismantling the entire conceptual framework of legitimacy itself. This is why royal bloodlines are protected obsessively. Genealogies become sacred texts. Marriage becomes theology. Succession becomes ritual. The throne becomes the last visible trace of divine presence after God's withdrawal. By the first millennium BC, Mesopotamia completes the system. Divine authority persists without divine presence. Surveillance replaces intervention. Interpretation replaces revelation. Institutions replace gods. And the record never explains why. Which brings us to the final question. If a civilization can be governed by an authority it never sees, how would it even recognize the moment that authority was gone? Maybe the Anunnaki were gods. Maybe they were memories. Maybe they were metaphors. But what remains undeniable is this: the architecture attributed to them outlived them. Power learned to rule without being seen. And once that happens, the gods never truly need to return. And that realization forces us to confront something uncomfortable, not about ancient gods, but about how authority itself functions. Because once power learns how to operate without presence, absence is no longer a weakness. It's an advantage. Visible rulers can be confronted. They can be questioned. They can be overthrown. They can be proven wrong. Invisible authority, by contrast, can never be directly tested. It can only be interpreted, and interpretation always favors those who control the interpretive tools. This is the final transformation we see in the Mesopotamian record. Authority no longer depends on gods acting, speaking, or appearing. It depends on belief in an originating source that can never be fully accessed, only mediated. Power becomes untouchable, not because it is overwhelming, but because it is abstracted beyond reach. The gods do not disappear. They become infrastructure. At that point, whether the Anunnaki were ever literal beings almost stops mattering. Their most durable achievement, if we can even call it that, was not ruling cities or issuing decrees. It was embedding legitimacy into systems that no longer require their involvement. Once authority is framed as descending from heaven, once law is framed as cosmic order rather than human construction, once kingship is framed as inheritance rather than consent, once interpretation is controlled by institutions, once surveillance is embedded into nature itself, the system runs on its own, and that may explain the silence. If there had been a dramatic departure, if gods had stood before humanity and announced their withdrawal, it would have created a moment that could be questioned, remembered, challenged. A clean break invites scrutiny, but a gradual reconfiguration leaves no such leverage point. The texts don't say the gods left, because functionally, nothing stopped working when they did. Kings still ruled, priests still interpreted, laws still bound, people still obeyed. From inside the system, there was no collapse to record. This may be why Mesopotamian scribes never describe a world without gods. Even when gods stop acting, their authority remains everywhere, embedded in ritual language, law, lineage, and expectation. Which leads to the most unsettling implication of all. If divine authority can persist without divine presence, then the real mechanism of control was never the gods themselves. It was the structure that claimed to represent them. And structures once accepted do not require belief in their origins to continue operating. They only require participation. People don't need to believe the gods still walk the earth. They only need to believe that authority comes from somewhere beyond themselves. That belief alone is enough. This doesn't mean the ancient texts are lying. It means they may be describing something more subtle than literal rule by gods or simple myth-making. They may be documenting the moment power learned how to transcend its founders, from visible rulers to invisible legitimacy to self-sustaining systems. And once that threshold is crossed, the question is no longer where did the gods go? The question becomes far more difficult. If a civilization can be governed by an authority it never sees, how would it even recognize the moment that authority stopped being real, or whether it ever was?